The snow came down like God himself had torn open the belly of the sky, and Harriet Hayes had never been so certain she was going to die. She had left Bozeman 3 days ago in what the livery stable owner had called a mild January spell, which turned out to be the most dangerous lie she had ever been told. The wagon trail north through the Montana Territory in the winter of 1878 was no place for a woman traveling alone, and yet here she was, her horse gone, her supplies scattered across a ravine she could no longer see in the whiteout, and her boots soaked through to the skin. She was 24 years old, a schoolteacher by trade, a widow by cruel circumstance, and she was running from the only life she had ever known toward something she could not yet name. The cold did not care about any of that. The cold only knew how to take. She had been walking for what felt like hours when she smelled the smoke. It was faint at first, just a thread of pine wood burn curling through the frozen air, and she turned her face into the wind and followed it the way a dying woman follows the sound of water. Her legs had gone mostly numb below the knee, and she had long since stopped feeling her fingers inside her wool gloves. The snow was past her ankles now, and every step required a concentration that left no room for thought, which was perhaps the only mercy the mountain offered. She could not think about Thomas. She could not think about the funeral, or the debt, or the men who had come to collect it, or the look on her sister-in-law's face when she had told Harriet that the house no longer belonged to her. She just followed the smoke. The cabin appeared out of the white like something conjured. It was low and solid, built from thick-cut pine logs that had darkened to the color of charcoal over many winters, and a single window glowed amber from within. Smoke poured from the stone chimney in a steady, determined column. There was a covered porch with snowshoes hanging from the beam and a pair of elk antlers mounted above the door, and the whole structure had the look of something that had been built to endure, built by hands that understood what endurance cost. Harriet stumbled up the 2 steps to the porch and knocked on the door with a fist that could barely form a fist anymore. For a long moment, nothing happened. She knocked again, harder, and her knuckles sang with pain. The door opened. The man who filled the doorframe was the largest person Harriet Hayes had ever stood in front of in her life. He was well over 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested not inherited bulk but years of work that had built him from the outside in. His arms, bare from the elbow down, were roped with muscle, and his chest strained the flannel of his shirt. His hair was dark brown and longer than fashion permitted, falling past his collar and curling slightly at the ends, and his jaw was covered in a thick, dark beard shot through with a thread or two of early gray. His eyes, when they found her face, were a particular shade of gray-green that reminded her of pine needles under ice. They were not unkind eyes, but they were not soft ones either. They were the eyes of a man who had looked at hard things for a long time and had not looked away. He looked at her without speaking for a moment that felt very long. She looked back at him and said, "I lost my horse," which was the truest thing she could manage. He stepped back from the door without a word and held it open for her. The inside of the cabin was small and warm, warmly lit by a fire in the stone hearth that took up most of the east wall and a single oil lamp on the rough-cut table. There was a narrow bed against the north wall under a heavy quilt, a wood stove in the corner that was doing serious work, a shelf of supplies, 2 mismatched chairs, and very little else. Pelts were stacked neatly near the door. A rifle hung on wooden pegs above the mantel. The floor was swept clean. Harriet stood in the middle of the room and dripped onto it. The man, still without speaking, moved to the fire and added 2 more logs to it. Then he crossed to the shelf and took down a wool blanket, heavy and slightly rough, and brought it to her. He held it out. She took it. He nodded once and went to the wood stove and began to do something with a pot she could not quite track because she was shaking too hard to track anything properly. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. He glanced at her over his shoulder. He said nothing. But the look was not dismissive. It was more like acknowledgement, which she was beginning to understand was a form of speech for him. She peeled off her coat, which was soaked and heavy, and hung it on the peg near the door where his own coat already hung. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and moved to stand before the fire, holding her hands toward the heat. The pain of warming up was considerable. She had forgotten that, or perhaps she had never known it before. She made small, involuntary sounds as the blood came back into her fingers. The man brought her a tin cup. It held something hot, broth of some kind, and she wrapped both hands around it and drank it too fast and burned her tongue and did not care at all. "My name is Harriet Hayes," she said, because she felt she owed him that. "I am a schoolteacher from Bozeman. I was traveling north to my cousin's homestead in the Judith Basin. My horse spooked at something in the ravine below the ridge and threw me. He ran off." She paused. "The supplies went with him." The man looked at her from across the room where he had resumed his seat in one of the chairs by the fire. He had a piece of leather in his hands and a small tool, and he appeared to be doing a repair of some kind. He listened to everything she said with his full attention, which was somehow more disconcerting than if he had ignored her. When she finished, he said, "Garrison." He said it simply, the way a person states a fact. "Micah Garrison." "Mr. Garrison," she said. He looked back at his work. Outside, the wind hit the cabin walls with a sound like a wave hitting a cliff, and the fire surged momentarily in the hearth. Harriet turned to look at it and felt the warmth on her face, and thought about all the things she had not allowed herself to think about on the trail, because thinking required stillness, and stillness on the trail would have killed her. She thought about Thomas, who had died of a fever in October. She thought about the debts he had left, the loans he had taken out from men whose names she had not known until after the funeral, men who came to the door with documents she did not understand. She thought about the school board in Bozeman, who had been kind but who could not pay her more than board and a modest salary, and the modest salary had not been enough. She thought about her cousin Ruth in the Judith Basin, who had written her in November and said there was a room and there was work, and she was welcome to come. She thought about how she had told herself this journey was hope. She had not expected hope to look like a whiteout on a mountain in January. She stood there, warming up slowly, and something broke open in her chest the way ice breaks open in spring, all at once and with a great deal of noise. Tears came down her face in a way she had not allowed since the morning she buried Thomas. She did not sob. She did not make any dramatic sound. The tears simply ran down her face in a steady, silent stream, and she stood there in front of the fire in a strange man's cabin, and cried the way a person cries when they have been holding everything for so long that the holding itself has become too heavy to carry. Micah Garrison looked up from his leather work. He looked at her for a long moment. He did not say a word. He did not ask what was wrong, and he did not tell her that things would be all right, and he did not make any move toward her that could be construed as inappropriate. He simply set down the leather and the tool, rose from the chair, and crossed to the wood box beside the hearth. He selected 3 more logs, large ones, dry and dense and good for a long burn. He arranged them in the fire with the careful deliberateness of a man who has built many fires and knows exactly what a fire needs to last. He added a 4th log, then adjusted the arrangement with a long iron poker until the draw was perfect and the fire had settled into the deep, steady burn that would hold for hours. He replaced the poker in its stand. He returned to his chair and picked up the leather again. He did not speak, but the fire burned. It burned strong and even and committed, throwing heat across the whole small room, and Harriet stood in front of it and cried until she had no more crying in her. He said nothing the entire time. He built the fire to last through the night, and somehow that was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in months. Eventually, she stopped crying. She wiped her face with the edge of the blanket. She took a long, steadying breath. "I am sorry," she said. He looked up at her again. There was no judgment in those gray-green eyes, no discomfort, no impatience. There was something else there that she could not quite name. He shook his head just once as if to say there was nothing to apologize for. She nodded and looked back at the fire. They stayed like that for a while, the two of them, the fire between them, the storm outside trying its best against the solid walls of the cabin, and not entirely succeeding. Micah Garrison was 31 years old, and he had lived in this corner of the Montana Territory for 6 years. Before that, he had been many things. He had been a ranch hand outside of Cheyenne, a freighter on the Oregon Trail, a scout for a brief and inglorious period when the Army was still pushing against the tribes of the Northern Plains, a venture that had ended badly for many parties and that he did not like to think about. He had come up into the Rockies the winter of 1872 and had not come back down except when necessity required it, which was not often. He trapped in the winter and hunted in the fall and kept a small kitchen garden in the brief Montana summer. He traded his pelts and his meat down in the valley settlements when the weather allowed. He spoke to very few people and preferred it that way, not because he was unfriendly, but because he had found over the years that solitude asked less of him than company did, and he had very little left to give. He did not tell any of this to Harriet Hayes that first night because she did not ask. She stood by the fire and dried out slowly and drank the broth he refilled for her without being asked, and eventually sat down in the other chair and stared into the flames. She had dark brown hair that the journey and the weather had destroyed somewhat, and brown eyes that were red-rimmed from the cold and the crying. She was a slight woman with straight shoulders and a mouth set in a particular kind of determined line, the line of someone who had learned to be stubborn, because stubborn was what kept you upright. She was, despite everything, remarkable looking. He noticed that the way he noticed most things quietly without acting on the noticing. When it was fully dark outside and the storm showed no signs of relenting, he told her the bed was hers. He said it in his flat, direct way, not inviting debate. She started to protest, but he had already moved to the wood box, and the matter in his bearing suggested he was not going to discuss it. He settled himself in the longer of the two chairs, pulled a heavy fur across his legs, and closed his eyes. He was asleep inside of 5 minutes, the way men who work with their bodies can be, suddenly and completely. Harriet watched him sleep for a moment. Then she looked at the fire, which was burning precisely as well as he had built it to burn. She pulled back the quilt on the bed and crawled beneath it with her blanket as an additional layer, and listened to the storm outside and the fire inside and the deep, even breathing of the stranger in the chair. She was asleep before she could finish the thought she had been meaning to think. In the morning the storm was over. The silence it left behind was the particular silence of very deep, fresh snow, muffled and absolute, and the light that came through the cabin window was blinding white. Harriet woke to the smell of coffee, which she had not expected, and found Micah Garrison at the wood stove, moving with the efficient, practiced ease of a man who does the same things in the same order every morning. He had a cast iron pan on the stove, and there were salt pork strips in it, and a battered coffee pot on the back burner. He appeared to have been awake for some time. He had also, she noticed, already gone outside because there were fresh snow tracks on the floor near the door and his coat was damp at the shoulders. She sat up. "Good morning," she said. He glanced at her. "Morning." He poured coffee into the same tin cup she had used the night before and set it on the table. He turned back to the stove. She got up and wrapped the blanket around herself and sat at the table and drank the coffee, which was strong enough to be nearly confrontational, and which she needed badly. She watched him cook in silence. He had a way of moving in confined space that was careful and economical, a big man in a small room, always precisely aware of where his elbows and his shoulders were. She found herself noticing the way his back moved under his shirt when he reached for things, the architecture of the muscles in his forearms where the shirt was rolled up. She looked away when she realized she was noticing. He put a plate of salt pork and a piece of pan bread in front of her without ceremony and sat across from her with his own and ate. She ate. The food was plain and good. After a time she said, "How bad is the trail north?" He considered this. "Impassable," he said. 3, maybe 4 days until it breaks enough for travel. She looked at the window. I see. He looked at her across the table. You are welcome here, he said. It was the longest sentence he had spoken since she arrived, and she understood from the weight of it that it cost him something to say it, not because he was reluctant, but because he was not a man who made offerings carelessly. Thank you, she said. I will not be a burden to you. Something shifted briefly in his expression, almost imperceptibly, that she could not quite read. He looked back down at his food. Over the next 3 days, Harriet Hayes learned Micah Garrison the way you learn a foreign country, not from a guide or a book, but from simply living inside of it and paying attention. She learned that he rose before dawn every morning and was outside before she woke, checking his trap lines on snowshoes, returning with whatever the land had offered. She learned that he rarely spoke unprompted, but that, when he did speak, every word had been selected with a precision that made her feel, each time, that she should pay attention. She learned that he had a worn, spine-broken copy of a novel by Charles Dickens on the shelf beside the supplies, which surprised her, and when she asked about it, he said simply that he had carried it from Wyoming and that it was a good book. She agreed that it was. On the second afternoon, with nothing to do but wait out the weather, she asked if she could be useful somewhere. He handed her a pile of pelts that wanted cleaning and showed her the method, which she did not know but learned quickly, and they sat on opposite sides of the small table and worked in a companionship that was quiet in a way she had not known quiet could be. Not empty, not awkward, simply at rest. She asked him once carefully if he had always been a man of few words. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I used to talk more. He said nothing further and she did not push, but she filed the information away as though it might matter later, which she had a feeling it might. On the second evening he made venison stew that was better than anything she had eaten in a long time, and she said so, and he looked genuinely surprised, as if the compliment had landed somewhere he had not expected to be touched. He cleared his throat and said the deer had been good this fall. She smiled, and he looked at her mouth for exactly 1 second and then looked somewhere else. That night she read aloud to him from the Dickens novel because the light was too dim for her eyes and she wanted to do something with her hands besides sit on them. He sat across from her and listened with his arms folded on the table and his eyes on the fire, and she thought that perhaps nobody had read to him in a very long time, and she read an extra chapter before she put the book down. He said, Thank you. It came out rough, like something unpracticed. She said, It was my pleasure, and meant it. On the third day she told him about Thomas, not everything but the shape of it. She told him they had been married 2 years, that he had been a good man with poor judgment in financial matters, that she had loved him with a practical love that was not the grand sort of love that people in novels described but was real and warm and hers, and that when he had died she had felt not only grief, but also a terrible guilt for discovering that grief and relief were not always separate feelings. She told him that she was not proud of the relief. She looked at her hands when she said this part. Micah listened to all of it. He did not flinch from the complicated parts. When she finished, he said, Grief does not have to be clean to be real. She looked up at him. He was looking at her steadily, and she thought that was perhaps the most precisely true thing anyone had ever said to her about losing Thomas. No, she said, it does not. He nodded and looked back at what he was doing, which was sharpening a knife on a whetstone, and the sound of the stone on the blade was careful and rhythmic and familiar. She wanted to ask him about his own losses because she sensed there were some large ones, the kind that change the course a person takes. She did not ask. She thought there would be time. She was not entirely sure why she thought there would be time when she was supposed to leave in a day, but she thought it nonetheless. On the 4th morning the trail had broken enough, he said, for travel. The sky was a hard, clear blue, the kind of blue that only exists in Montana in winter, and the snow sparkled in a way that was beautiful and also merciless. Harriet packed what little she had, which was not much, and stood at the door of the cabin with her coat on and the wool blanket folded over her arm, which she intended to return to him. She held it out. He shook his head. She held it out further. "It is your blanket." "Keep it," he said. "It is cold in the Judith Basin." She stood there looking at him. He was standing in the doorway of the cabin, filling it, the mountains behind him white and enormous and indifferent, and the early morning light on his face, and she thought with a sudden and inconvenient clarity that she did not particularly want to leave. This surprised her. She had been telling herself for 4 days that she was an inconvenience to him, that she would get to Ruth's homestead and start a new life, and this strange, quiet interlude would become a memory she took out occasionally like a pressed flower, something to look at and then put away. Standing in front of him with his blanket in her hands, she could not quite convince herself of any of that. "Thank you," she said. "For the fire, for all of it." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes for a long moment. He opened his mouth and then closed it. Then he said, "The trail north goes through the lower valley. Keep the ridge on your left. There is a trading post at the fork, 11 miles. They can put you on a wagon north." "All right," she said. "Stay on the low trail," he said. "Do not try the ridge, not in this." "I will not," she said. He nodded. She turned and went down the porch steps into the snow. She was 10 yards from the cabin when he said her name. She turned around. He was standing at the edge of the porch, one hand on the beam. He said, "If the weather turns again, come back." She looked at him. He was not a man who said things he did not mean. She understood that already as well as she had ever understood anything. "I will," she said. The trail to the trading post was 11 miles of quiet white country that Harriet spent in a state of complicated thought. She thought about the Judith Basin and Ruth, who was good-hearted and practical and who had a homestead and a husband and 3 children and not quite enough room for another person but had offered any way out of generosity. She thought about what she would do there. Teach, probably, if there was a school. Help with the children. Start over. She said the words to herself like a kind of prayer. Start over. But they had the feeling of words that had been borrowed rather than words that belonged to her. She thought about Micah Garrison. She thought about the way he had said nothing when she cried and simply built the fire higher. She thought about the way he had looked at her when she read to him, that particular look of someone receiving something they had not known they were hungry for. She thought about what it meant to make someone feel at home in 4 days without trying, without even particularly speaking. She arrived at the trading post in the early afternoon. It was a low building with a hitching rail, and a sign she could barely read, and a smell of tobacco and horse that hit her before she opened the door. There were 3 men inside, a pair of trappers and the owner, a man named Fletcher who had a red beard and a kind face. She asked about wagons north, and he told her there was one leaving the day after tomorrow, a supply run up to a settlement near Lewistown, and she was welcome to ride along if she could pay for the passage. She had a small amount of money left in the inside pocket of her coat, enough for this and not much else. She said yes. She ate supper at the trading post and slept in the small room Fletcher's wife rented to travelers and lay on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind outside. She was warm enough. There was a small stove in the corner and it was doing what small stoves do, which is to say it was trying. But it was not the same kind of warm she had been for the past 4 days, and she noticed the difference with a clarity that was inconvenient. She told herself she was being foolish. She told herself that for approximately the next 24 hours. On the morning the wagon was to leave, she was standing in front of the trading post with her bundle in her hands when she thought very clearly, with the particular clarity that comes just before a decision is made, that she had not thanked him properly, that she had left without saying the full truth of what those 4 days had meant to her. That she was getting on a wagon going north and she would likely never see Micah Garrison again, and she was not sure she had the right to add that to the list of things she was sorry for. The wagon driver was a taciturn man named Holt, who did not seem particularly invested in leaving at any particular moment. She told him she would be 1 more hour. He shrugged. She borrowed a horse from Fletcher, who asked no questions but looked at her in a way that suggested he had seen this particular flavor of decision before, and she rode back south along the low trail with the ridge on her left. The cabin was exactly where she had left it. She tied the horse at the porch rail and knocked on the door with more confidence than she had managed the first time. There was a pause. The door opened. Micah Garrison looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read and then, slowly, shifted into something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Something that happened in his eyes more than in the set of his mouth. "The wagon north," he said. It was not quite a question. "It is leaving this morning," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I came back," she said, "because I wanted to tell you properly what those 4 days meant." She stopped. She had practiced a speech on the ride back and it had completely abandoned her. "You did not have to take me in, and you said nothing when I was crying, and you just built the fire up. And I have been thinking about that since I left, and I think it is the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time, perhaps ever." She stopped again. "I wanted you to know that." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Then Micah said, "Come inside." She came inside. He put coffee on. She sat at the table. He sat across from her, and the fire that he had clearly already stoked that morning was burning steadily behind him. He looked at her with his arms resting on the table and his hands loose, and he said, "Where is it you are going in the Judith Basin?" "To my cousin Ruth's homestead," she said. "Ruth and her husband. She offered me a room." "You have people there," he said. "Ruth," she said. "We were close as girls." "I haven't seen her in 4 years." She looked at her coffee. "Honestly, I am going there because I did not know where else to go, and because it seemed like something one does when everything falls apart. Go to family." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you want to go?" The question hit her harder than she expected because it was precisely the right question, and she had been very carefully not asking it of herself. She looked at him. He was watching her with that still, patient attentiveness that she had come to understand was not blankness but its opposite, a man paying full attention. "I do not know," she said, which was the most honest thing she had said in weeks. He nodded. He said, "You do not have to decide now." She looked at him. "The wagon leaves this morning." "Then it leaves," he said simply, not cruelly, simply. As if the wagon's leaving and her decision were two things that did not necessarily have to be connected. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, a raven landed on the porch rail and made a sound and flew away. The fire popped. Somewhere in the mountains above them, the world was very large and very cold and very still. "I would like to stay," she said. She had not known she was going to say it until she said it. "For a little while longer, if that is all right." He looked at her. Something moved through those gray-green eyes that she still could not quite name. "It is all right," he said. She nodded. "I will write to Ruth." He nodded back. She rode back to the trading post and told Holt she would not be taking the wagon after all. He shrugged again in the same way he had shrugged the first time, a man unbothered by the changeable nature of other people's plans. She wrote a letter to Ruth at Fletcher's trading post, explaining that she had been delayed by weather and that she was staying a short time with a man who had taken her in during the storm, a reputable man, a mountain trapper of good character, and that she would write again when she had clearer plans. She sealed the letter and paid Fletcher to send it north on the next mail carrier, and then she borrowed Fletcher's horse again and rode back up the trail to the cabin. Micah Garrison did not make a fuss about her return. He made room for her belongings on the shelf beside his own, cleared the second peg by the door for her coat, and split an extra cord of wood that afternoon that he stacked neatly against the cabin wall. These were not grand gestures. They were the gestures of a man who did not deal in grand gestures, but who understood that space and warmth and preparation were the way you showed another person that they were welcome. She watched him split wood through the window, the axe rising and falling with a rhythm that was mechanical in its precision and hypnotic to watch. He did not seem cold. He worked in his shirt with his coat on the porch rail, and the muscles in his shoulders and back moved with each swing in a way that made the task look easy, which she knew from her farm girlhood it was not. She looked away from the window and picked up the Dickens novel. Over the following weeks, Harriet stopped thinking of the cabin as a temporary shelter and began, cautiously, to inhabit it in the way you inhabit a place you have decided is yours for now. She organized the supply shelf more efficiently, which Micah observed without comment but which she noticed he did not change back. She discovered that he had a small collection of other books wrapped in oilcloth in a box under the bed, a volume of Tennyson's poems, a battered almanac from 1873, and a practical guide to plants of the Western Territories. She asked him about the Tennyson, and he said a woman in Cheyenne had given it to him, and that he had read it several times. She did not ask about the woman in Cheyenne, and he did not elaborate. She began to help with more of the daily work. She was not a woman who sat idle. She could cook, and she improved on the limited pantry with the things she had traded for at the post on a supply run she made with him on one of the milder days. She made a proper bread that used the starter she coaxed into being from a wild yeast, and when he tasted it he looked at her with an expression that had more warmth in it than any expression she had seen from him yet. "That is a good bread," he said. "My mother's recipe," she said. He nodded, and then he said, "Tell me about your mother." She had not expected that. She looked at him across the table and saw that he was genuinely asking, not making conversation but asking, and so she told him. She told him about her mother, who had been a Missouri woman of extraordinary practicality and deep undemonstrated love, who had raised Harriet and her two brothers on a hardscrabble farm outside of Independence, who had taught Harriet to read before she sent her to the schoolhouse, who had died of typhoid in 1872, and whom she still missed with a longing that had not diminished with time. Micah listened to all of it with his full attention, and when she was finished he said, "She sounds like someone worth missing." It was such a simple thing to say, and it was exactly right, and Harriet felt her throat tighten and her eyes sting, and she looked at the ceiling and breathed through it until the feeling passed. "Yes," she said, "she was." Then she asked him, finally, the question she had been holding. She asked him what had brought him up into the mountains and kept him there. She asked it carefully, watching his face as she did, prepared to pull the question back if he showed any sign of not wanting to answer. He did not pull away from it. He sat with it for a moment, looking at his hands on the table, and then he said that he had a brother, past tense, Marcus, 2 years younger. They had come out west together from Ohio in 1868 when their father's farm failed. They had worked cattle in Kansas and Wyoming, and had signed on as scouts for the Army in the summer of 1872, which Micah said was the worst decision he had ever made, not because the work was hard, but because of what the work required of a man and what it took from him in exchange. He said it plainly, without self-pity or dramatization. Marcus had been killed in a skirmish near the Tongue River in the winter of 1872. Micah had carried him 3 miles back to camp in the snow. He had buried him in the frozen ground of the Montana Territory. He had left the army the next morning and had not come back down from the mountains since. Harriet did not say she was sorry. She had a feeling he had heard that enough and that it had not helped. Instead she said, "Was he like you?" Something flickered in his face. "No," he said. "He talked enough for both of us." A pause that held something that might have been amusement, very old and quiet. "He was better company." She shook her head. "I find your company very good," she said. He looked at her. The warmth was there again in his eyes, fuller now, less guarded. He held her gaze for a moment longer than he usually did. Then he looked away. That evening she read to him from the Tennyson, choosing carefully, and she read break, break, break because she had always loved it and thought he might. And when she finished there was a silence in the room that was full rather than empty, and he said, "Read it again." So she did. February came in hard and then broke early with a week of warmer weather that brought steam up off the snowpack and made the south-facing slopes begin to show strips of bare brown ground. Harriet and Micah began to spend more time outside in the afternoons, sometimes walking a short distance along the slopes around the cabin while there was still enough light. He showed her things as they walked. He showed her the tracks of a wolverine in the snow near a rock outcropping, and explained how he could tell from the pattern of movement what the animal had been doing. He showed her a stand of quaking aspen that he said would be worth seeing in the fall, when they went gold. He showed her where a creek ran under the ice below the cabin and where it would open up in the spring. He talked more than she had initially thought he could. It was just that he only talked about things that mattered to him, and his things that mattered were very specific: the land, the animals, the particular ways the mountain changed through the seasons. When he talked about these things, he was not quiet. He was detailed and alive in a way that she found entirely captivating. She walked beside him one afternoon on the slope above the cabin, the snow shallow enough now that they did not need snowshoes, and the late winter sun was warm on her face, and her breath was visible in the still air. And she thought, with a fullness that surprised her, that she was happy. It was the specific, grounded happiness that comes from being in the right place, which she had not felt in a long time and which she had not entirely expected to feel in quite this way. He stopped on the slope and pointed north, to where the mountains opened into a wide valley framed by peaks. "There," he said. "In the summer that is green, every shade of green there is." He paused. "I have never gotten tired of looking at it." She looked where he was pointing, and then she looked at him, at his profile against the winter sky, the strong jaw, the dark hair that the wind had moved slightly, the set of his shoulders. A man entirely at home in an enormous landscape, and she understood something that she had perhaps been understanding slowly for several weeks, and was only now arriving at fully. She was falling in love with him. The understanding arrived not with alarm or fanfare, but with the quiet inevitability of something that has been true for a while finally being acknowledged. She looked back at the valley. She breathed in the cold, clean air. She said, "It is beautiful." He looked at her then, not at the valley, at her, and then he looked back at the valley without speaking. But something had shifted between them, some adjustment in the weather of the space they occupied together, and she felt it and thought he probably felt it too. That night after supper, he did not sit across from her at the table but pulled his chair beside hers near the fire, which he had not done before, and they read together, her reading aloud and him following along when he could see the page and just listening when he could not. His shoulder was 4 inches from hers, and she was acutely aware of it the entire time, the warmth of him, the solidity, the way he occasionally leaned slightly closer when she turned a page as if to see what came next. She stopped reading mid-sentence. She was aware that her heart was doing something inconvenient. She looked up from the page and found that he was already looking at her, very close now, those gray-green eyes steady and serious and something more than serious. "Harriet," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought for a moment that he was going to say something difficult or complicated, the way men sometimes did when they were trying to talk themselves out of feeling something. Instead he said, "I would like to keep you here if you are willing." It was not a flowery declaration. It was the most honest thing she had ever been offered. She said, "I think I am very willing." He lifted one large, calloused hand and touched her face with the back of his fingers, just her cheek briefly, with the same deliberate care he brought to everything, and she felt it everywhere. Then he let his hand drop. He nodded as if they had settled something important between them, which perhaps they had. He looked back at the fire. She looked at the fire too. She was smiling. She could feel that she was smiling. She did not bother to stop. Over the next several weeks, the thing between them grew in the way things grow in difficult country, slowly, with great deliberateness, rooted deep before it showed much above the surface. Micah was not a man who rushed anything, and Harriet found that she did not want to be rushed, that the slow unfolding of it suited her, that each small step felt significant in a way that suited the landscape and the time and the two of them specifically. He began to reach for her hand when they walked outside, not dramatically, just a taking of her hand in his that was so natural it was almost matter of fact, and the warmth of his hand around hers in the cold air was the best feeling she could remember. He began to stand closer to her when they worked together in the kitchen space, his presence at her back or her shoulder a steady, warm gravity. In the evenings by the fire he would often put his hand on the arm of her chair, close enough that she could feel the warmth from him, and she would sometimes lay her hand over his, and he would turn his hand over and hold hers, and they would sit like that for a long time. He told her more about Marcus. He told her stories about their boyhood in Ohio, the farm, the river they had swum in summers, a misadventure involving a neighbor's bull and a fence that had clearly been dangerous at the time, and was now, with enough distance, almost funny. He told the stories in his quiet way, sparing on words, but she could feel Marcus in them, his outline, his energy, his younger brotherness. She listened to all of it and understood that he was giving her something he did not give easily, and she received it carefully. She told him more too. She told him about her schoolroom in Bozeman, about the children she had taught, and the ones who had stayed in her memory. A boy named Edgar who had read everything she put in front of him, and whom she had given her own copy of Robinson Crusoe on the last day of school before she left, hoping it would carry him somewhere. She told him about learning to ride badly and about her complicated relationship with horses in general, which made him laugh, actually laugh, and the sound of it filled the cabin in a way that made her feel like a window had been opened. "You are afraid of horses," he said. "I am not afraid," she said. "I am respectful." "You are afraid," he said. "And that is all right." She narrowed her eyes at him. He was still smiling, and she thought it was possible that it was the best thing she had ever seen. March came, and with it the first real suggestion of spring, the snowpack beginning to recede seriously on the south slopes, the creek below the cabin throwing off its ice in chunks, the air carrying something warmer and wilder in it. Micah's work shifted with the season, less trapping, more preparation for the thaw, the trap lines coming in, the attention turning to what the land would need from him in the growing months. He talked about planting. He talked about the garden, what had grown well last year and what he wanted to try differently. He talked about these things with her, consulted her, which she recognized as a form of inclusion that meant something. One morning in early March she woke to find him already at the table with paper and a pencil, bent over what appeared to be a rough drawing. He showed it to her when she asked. It was a plan for expanding the cabin's single room, adding a proper second room on the north end. He showed her where the addition would go, explaining the construction with a practical thoroughness that told her he had been thinking about it for some time. She looked at the drawing. She looked at him. "You are planning to build," she said. "Yes," he said. She understood what the drawing meant in the context of the thing that had been growing between them. She understood what he was saying without saying it. He was not a man who proposed in speeches, she had come to know that, but he was also not a man who built additions to his cabin for no reason. She sat down across from him. "Micah," she said. He looked up from the drawing. "Are you asking me to stay?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "I am asking you to stay." She looked at him. This man who had taken her in from a storm and built her a fire and given her his bed and his blanket and his silence, when she needed silence and his words, when she needed words and his hand and his stories, and all the slow, deep, careful warmth of him. She looked at him and thought about the schoolroom in Bozeman that she did not have any more, and the house that was no longer hers, and the cousin Ruth in the Judith Basin, and the life she had been heading toward when the storm had changed the direction of everything. She thought about what it would mean to stay. She thought about what it would mean not to. "Yes," she said, "I will stay." Something in his face that had been held, not tension exactly, but a kind of bracing, released. He let out a slow breath. He reached across the drawing and put his hand over hers on the table. His hand was enormous compared to hers and warm and very certain. "I should tell you," he said, "that I have not been good company for a long time, that I have been living alone so long I may have forgotten things a person is supposed to remember." "I do not need you to remember things," she said. "I need you to be what you are." He looked at her. His thumb moved across her knuckles. "Harriet," he said. In that particular way he said her name, low and deliberate. "Yes," she said. "I love you," he said. "I should tell you that plainly." She felt the words land in her chest like a warm stone dropped into still water, the ripple of them spreading outward. She had known it, in the way you know the sun is coming before it rises, but to hear him say it, to hear this man who said almost nothing say those particular words out loud, was something different from knowing. "I love you too," she said, plainly. His smile, when it came, was full, the smile of a man who had been a long time arriving somewhere and had finally gotten there. She got up from her side of the table and came to his side, and he turned in his chair to face her, and she stood in front of him, and he looked up at her, and she put her hands on either side of his face, feeling the rough beard under her palms, and she kissed him once properly, which he received with the same stillness he brought to all things, and then returned with a depth of feeling that was not still at all. They were married in April, when the trail down to the valley was properly open, at the small church in the settlement of Two Forks, which was a 14-mile ride, and the first time Harriet had been on horseback since her horse threw her in the blizzard. She was deeply nervous about both the riding and the marrying, and she said so to Micah that morning as they stood outside the cabin in the early spring light. He cupped her face in his hands and looked at her with those gray-green eyes and said, "The horse will not throw you, and neither will I," she laughed, which she had not expected to do that particular morning. "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me," she told him. "I will do better," he said. "No," she said. "That was exactly right." The wedding was attended by Fletcher from the trading post, who came down with his wife and who turned out to have a surprisingly fine singing voice, and by a settler family named Prescott who had a homestead in the lower valley and who brought a pie made of dried apples that was extraordinary. The minister was a brisk man named Elder Connolly, who performed the ceremony with efficiency but with genuine warmth, and when he asked if there were rings, Micah reached into his shirt pocket and produced a simple band of gold that he had obtained from the settlement's general store on his most recent supply run, which he had not told her about, and slid it onto her finger with a steadiness that was very him, careful and deliberate and absolutely committed. "I take this seriously," he told her when she looked at the ring, which she had not expected. "I know," she said, "so do I." They rode back to the cabin in the late afternoon with the mountains around them turning gold in the setting sun, and Harriet Garrison, who had been Harriet Hayes until this morning, thought that the world looked different from the back of a horse when you were not afraid of it, or when you were afraid of it but had decided that the destination was worth the fear. The spring became summer, and the mountain became the thing that Micah had described to her in winter, green in every shade there was. He expanded the kitchen garden substantially with her help, and she took pride in what she grew there, in the rows of vegetables coming up from the dark soil as if they had agreed to be there. The expansion of the cabin began in June. Micah did most of the heavy construction himself, and she helped where she could, and in the evenings after the work was done, they would sit on the porch in the last light and she would lean against him, and they would look at the valley and talk or not talk, both of which were equally comfortable. She wrote to Ruth in the Judith Basin, not just the one letter but several, and Ruth wrote back with the good-natured bewilderment of a woman who had expected her widowed cousin to come help with the children, and had instead received news of a mountain man and a wedding. Ruth's letters were warm and funny, and she said in her third letter that she intended to come see this husband for herself at the earliest opportunity, a visit which Harriet genuinely anticipated. Ruth came in August with her husband Peter and the 3 children, and spent 3 days at the cabin. Peter Dawson was a good man, a farmer from Iowa who shook Micah's hand with the careful assessment of a man sizing up another man's character. And within the first afternoon, the two of them had found enough common ground in practical matters to have a decent conversation about irrigation and construction and the merits of different breeds of cattle. Ruth cornered Harriet on the second morning while the men were outside and said, in the direct way that Harriet had always loved about her, "He is extraordinary, Harriet. However did you find him in the middle of a blizzard?" "He found me," Harriet said, Ruth looked at her with the slightly suspicious happiness of someone who wants to confirm that what they are seeing is real. "You are genuinely happy," she said. "I am genuinely happy," Harriet said. Ruth hugged her tightly and did not let go for a long moment. "Good," she said. "Lord knows you are overdue for some good." When the Dawsons left at the end of the 3 days, Micah stood next to Harriet on the porch and watched the wagon go down the trail until it disappeared around the bend. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into his side. "Your cousin is formidable," he said. "She is the best person I know," Harriet said. "Present company considered." He looked down at her. "Second," he said firmly. She laughed and leaned further into him. The summer moved into fall, and the aspens went gold exactly as he had promised they would, brilliant and trembling in the mountain wind. And Harriet stood among them one afternoon and held her breath because the beauty of it was almost too much. Micah came up behind her and put his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on the top of her head and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and she held his arms where they crossed over her front, and they stood there together in the gold until the light changed. That autumn she knew she was expecting their child. She told him on an evening in October, sitting by the fire after supper, setting down her mending and looking at him directly and saying simply, "We are going to have a baby in the spring." He went very still. She watched him. He set down the piece of harness he had been working on with the same deliberateness with which he set down all things, and he looked at her, and she saw something move across his face that was complex and overwhelming, joy and something like fear, and something else that she recognized as the particular emotion of a person who has been alone for a very long time being offered something they had not allowed themselves to want. He reached across and took both her hands in his, which dwarfed them. He held them carefully. "In the spring," he said. "April, I think," she said. He looked at their joined hands. He swallowed. "Harriet," he said, and stopped. "I know," she said. He looked up at her, and his eyes were bright in the firelight, and she thought she might love him more in this moment than she had in any preceding moment, which had seemed impossible because she had been loving him fiercely for months. "I do not have words for this," he said. "You do not need them," she said. He lifted her hands and pressed them to his lips, both of them together, and held them there for a long moment. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was hard but not brutal, the mountains doing what mountains do in winter without going to the extremes of the previous year. They had prepared well. The root cellar was full, the woodpile was substantial, the cabin was warm and tight. Harriet moved through the months of her pregnancy with the particular contained radiance of a healthy woman who is happy and well-fed and well-loved, her body doing what it was doing with a purposefulness that she found, somewhat to her surprise, deeply interesting. Micah was attentive in his way, not hovering, not fussing, but quietly and continuously present, making sure she was warm, adjusting her workload without being asked in ways that were subtle enough not to feel condescending, bringing her particular foods when she mentioned a craving, which she generally mentioned without thinking, and he always somehow remembered. In February, she caught a chill that kept her in bed for 3 days, nothing serious but enough to make her feel fragile and sorry for herself, which she was not accustomed to feeling. Micah stayed close during those 3 days, keeping the fire and the stove running at their peak, making soup she could taste even though her sense of smell was compromised, sitting with her in the evenings with his hand on her ankle through the quilt, a point of contact that she found extraordinarily comforting. When she was back on her feet and declared herself fully recovered, he looked her over with a thoroughness that she found slightly amusing, and then said, with great seriousness, "Do not do that again." She raised her eyebrows. "You want me not to catch any more chills?" "Yes," he said. "I will do my absolute best," she said. He nodded as if they had struck a deal. On a morning in late April, which smelled already of the new season coming on, their son was born. It was a long labor and a difficult one, attended by a woman named Edith Prescott from the Valley homestead below, who was the nearest thing to a midwife in the territory, and who had brought 3 of her own children into the world and 3 others besides. Micah stayed close throughout, which Edith permitted because he was clearly not the sort of man who fainted at difficult circumstances, and because Harriet wanted him there. He held her hand through the hard parts with a grip that was iron and steady and never wavered, even when she gripped back hard enough to hurt, which she did. The baby came into the world in the early morning and announced himself at volume. Edith put him in Harriet's arms, wrapped in a clean cloth, and Harriet looked down at his red, furious, perfect face and felt the full weight of the moment settle over her. Micah was beside her, his large hand curved around the back of her head with an exquisite gentleness. He looked at the baby with an expression that she had never seen on him before and could not quite categorize, except that it was the expression of a man encountering something that has permanently altered everything about how he understands the world. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly. The baby stopped crying. Harriet laughed, which turned into tears, which she was not ashamed of. "He listened to you," she said. "He is very smart," Micah said with complete seriousness. They named him James Marcus Garrison. James for her father, Marcus for his brother. James Marcus grew with the spring, pulling himself upright and filling the cabin with a vitality that transformed the space entirely. Micah was not a man who made a performance of fatherhood, but he was present in it the way he was present in everything, completely and without reservation. He carried the baby in one arm while he worked with the other hand, which was a feat that impressed everyone who saw it. He talked to the baby while he worked in the garden, explaining what he was planting and why, in the same tone he might use with any interested party, and the baby listened with the rapt attention of someone who was getting information he intended to use later. Summer came again, and Harriet began to think about the school question. There were enough children in the valley settlements below that a school was a real possibility, something she had discussed with the Prescotts, and with a newer homestead family named Garber who had 3 school-age children and were eager for it. She brought the idea to Micah on the porch one evening, laying it out carefully, the logistics of how it might work, perhaps 1 or 2 days a week in the settlement meeting house until a proper schoolroom could be built. And he listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which she had learned meant he was genuinely considering it. When she finished, he said, "It is what you know how to do." "Yes," she said. "Then you should do it," he said. She looked at him. "You would not mind the days away from the cabin." He looked at her with something that might have been gentle exasperation or the closest to it that he came. "Harriet," he said, "I want you to have the full of your life, not just the part of it that is mine." She was quiet for a moment with the immensity of that. "Micah Garrison," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you very much." He reached over and took her hand and held it in his and looked out at the mountains. "I know," he said. And then, after a moment, with something in his voice that was warm and somewhat wry, "I love you very much too." She started the school in September of 1879, 2 days a week at the Prescott homestead's large kitchen until spring, when the men of the valley settlements came together and built a proper 1-room schoolhouse at the base of the mountain trail. Micah helped with the construction, working alongside the other men on the weekends, and she thought that watching him put up a building that would house her school was perhaps the most specifically him kind of love gesture she could imagine. The school had 11 students by its first full year, ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she taught them with the full resources of her learning and her particular belief that every child in front of her was worth the full effort of her attention. She carried James with her on teaching days for the first year until he was old enough to stay with Micah, and the older students took turns minding him while she taught, which they regarded as a privilege and James regarded as his due. Life on the mountain settled into the rhythms that become, over time, not routine but something better than routine, the texture of a life that is being fully lived. Seasons turned and the work changed with them, and the cabin grew incrementally with each summer's construction efforts. Another shelf, a proper porch extension, a small barn for the animals they gradually acquired. Micah built a writing desk for her the winter of 1880, working on it in the evenings while she was reading or tending to James, building it from a good piece of pine he had been saving. And when he set it by the window and she sat at it and looked out at the mountain, she could not speak for a moment. "For your letters," he said, "and for whatever else you want to write." She had not told him that she had been writing haltingly in the margins of things, thoughts about the mountain and about teaching and about love in the particular form it took out here, the wild and the hard and the beautiful all wound together. She had not told him because she was not sure it was anything yet. "You know I have been writing," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "How did you know?" he said. "I know most things about you." She thought about all the ways in which that was deeply true and deeply fine. The second child came in the summer of 1881, a girl who arrived with considerably more efficiency than her brother had, and who looked from the very beginning like she had decided opinions about everything and intended to express them. They named her Clara Ruth, the Ruth for Harriet's cousin, and Ruth Dawson wept when she received the letter and wept again when she came to visit the following spring and held the baby in her arms. James Marcus, who was 2 years old and extremely invested in his own standing in the household, inspected his sister with the suspicion of a general reviewing an unexpected development and eventually determined over several days that she was acceptable. He patted her head once with enormous gravity, and Micah, watching, turned away to look at the wall in a way that Harriet recognized as him handling strong emotion that he did not want to perform publicly. She put her arm around his waist. He put his arm around her shoulders. They stood together and watched their son regard their daughter, and the fire was burning in the hearth, and outside the mountain summer was doing everything it knew how to do. Harriet wrote to Elder Connolly in the spring of 1882, asking if he would be willing to come up for a formal blessing of the homestead, which had grown into something she felt deserved to be marked. He came in June and sat on their porch and drank coffee and admired the view and said a blessing over the house and the family in it that was simple and genuine and made Harriet press her lips together to hold herself steady. After, while Micah took the children down the slope to show James a rabbit warren he had found, Elder Connolly sat with Harriet on the porch and said, "I have married a good many couples, Mrs. Garrison, and I do not always know how they will fare. The ones who surprise me most are usually the quieter ones, the ones who are not performing it." She watched Micah on the slope below, carrying Clara on his hip while James ran ahead, his long stride adjusted to the children's pace without appearing to be adjusted, that natural accommodation he brought to everything. "He is the best man I have ever known," she said. She said it simply as a fact. Elder Connolly nodded. "I can see that," he said. In the fall of 1882, Harriet received a letter from Bozeman. It was from Edgar, the boy from her schoolroom, the one she had given Robinson Crusoe to on her last day. He was 16 now and had tracked her address through Ruth, who had given it readily. He wrote to tell her that he had read the book 11 times and that he was going to be a teacher himself when he was older. He asked if she had any advice. He wrote in a neat, careful hand that told her the effort he had put into the letter. She sat down at the desk Micah had built her and wrote him back at length, giving him every piece of advice she had, filling 3 sheets of paper, and when she was done, she felt the particular satisfaction of something that was done well and that mattered. She sealed it and set it on the corner of the desk to go out with the next mail rider, and then she went to find Micah to tell him about it. He was in the small barn brushing down the horse, and she stood in the barn door and told him about Edgar and the letter, and he listened while his hands kept moving over the horse's flank in long, even strokes. When she finished, he said, "You changed that boy's direction." "I just gave him a book," she said. "That is how it is done," he said. She leaned in the barn doorway and smiled at him. The late afternoon light came in at an angle through the gaps in the barn boards and lay in strips across the floor and across him, and he looked up from the horse and found her watching him, and the look that passed between them was the look of 2 people who have built something real together and know it. "Come here," he said. She came to him across the barn floor, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into his chest, and he pressed his lips to the top of her head, and they stood like that in the barn with the horse and the autumn light and the smell of hay and the sound of the children's voices somewhere outside. James calling something to Clara, Clara's higher voice responding. "Harriet," he said into her hair. "Yes," she said. "I am glad the storm came," he said. She pulled back enough to look up at him. He was looking down at her with those gray-green eyes, steady and full. "I am glad I knocked on your door," she said. He touched her face with the back of his fingers, the same way he had that very first time, the gesture that had begun it all, still careful, still deliberate, still meaning everything he could not always say. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said back. "Every day." She put her hand over his where it lay against her cheek. Outside, James called for his father at the top of his lungs, the way that 4-year-old boys call for their fathers, with the full emergency of a non-emergency, and Micah smiled against her forehead and said, "I am needed." "You are always needed," she said. "That is the difference." He kissed her once properly, and then released her and went out of the barn into the golden Montana afternoon to find his son, his long strides carrying him across the yard, his dark hair in the autumn wind, the mountains enormous and patient behind him. She stood in the barn doorway and watched him go, and Clara came toddling around the corner of the cabin toward her, arms out, and she scooped her daughter up and stood there holding her against her hip. The valley below was going amber and bronze in the fall light, and the aspens on the slope were at their peak gold, and the sky was the blue that only existed here, that hard, particular, enormous Montana blue. The cabin stood solid and sure behind her, the chimney already sending up the first smoke of the evening fire, which Micah must have built before he came to the barn, timed as it always was to be hot enough to warm the house by supper time. He always built the fire just right. He always had. She had been a woman alone in a storm, running toward a future she could not picture, when the storm had changed everything. She had knocked on a door, and a man had opened it and had taken her in without conditions and without words, and had built a fire to last through the night, and in doing so had changed the course of both their lives so completely that she could not now imagine the life she had been heading toward before, could not see its shape or want its shape. James called again from somewhere around the front of the cabin, and she heard Micah's low voice in response and James's answering delight, and Clara said "Papa" in her cabin, which was one of her recently acquired words, said with great authority. "Yes," Harriet told her daughter. "Papa." She carried Clara around the side of the cabin and found Micah crouched on the ground beside James, examining something in the dirt that James had apparently discovered and deemed worthy of his father's full analysis. Micah was looking at whatever it was with complete seriousness, which was exactly what James required and always received. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and his eyes found her face, and the warmth in them was the same warmth that had been there from almost the beginning, present and constant as the fire he built each night, steady in all weathers. "Come see," James said, looking up at her with enormous eyes. "Papa says it is a beetle." "A very good beetle," Micah said gravely. "The finest beetle," Harriet agreed, crouching down on James's other side so that the four of them were gathered around the extraordinary beetle on the ground, the family of them, on the mountain in the fall light. She reached across James and put her hand on Micah's knee, and he covered it with his own without looking up from the beetle, his thumb moving over her knuckles in that particular way that meant everything and meant "I am here" and meant "I will always be here." And the mountains were around them on all sides, patient and enormous and full of every shade of gold. The storm had come down like the end of the world, and from the wreckage of it she had been given this. Every day of it. Every cold morning and warm fire and quiet evening and loud child-filled afternoon. Every word he said and every word he didn't say, and every fire he built, and every way he touched her face, and every time he said her name like it was the only word that mattered. All of it, growing and deepening and rooting further down into the mountain soil with every season that passed, more solid than the logs of the cabin, more enduring than the winter, more alive than the summer green. She looked at him over their son's head, this man who had found her in a storm and kept her, this man of few words and enormous heart, and he looked back at her across the small distance. And the look was everything, the full language of them, everything they were and had been and would be. Clara patted Harriet's cheek with one small hand. James said the beetle had moved. Micah said, "Let him go where he is going." And the four of them watched the beetle go where it was going in the last gold light of the Montana afternoon, and the fire was burning in the cabin behind them, built to last through the night.